Hi there, it's Adewale here from stresstherapist.net. Today I want to ask a question. Can stress management really help us manage life better? Personally, I believe that emotional difficulties do not have to make our dreams, goals, aspirations, and progress in life feel so impossible to achieve. Sadly, though, the reality for many of us is that our emotional difficulties tend to act as barriers that limit our experiences in life, making us feel like prisoners in our own lives. This may lead to a number of difficulties. For example, being stuck indoors due to anxiety, struggling to motivate ourselves to face our daily activities, experiencing difficulty holding down our jobs, or an inability to manage our workload effectively, or struggling to form and develop meaningful relationships, and the list goes on. Fortunately, once we are able to understand and utilize this one rule of emotional management that I'm going to be sharing with you today, we'll experience that our ability to cope will be so much easier. But before I tell you what this rule is, let me share my current understanding of why coping can be so difficult to manage. It all begins with psychological stress. Stress is that intangible mental and physical force that limits a person's ability to respond to life situations in the ways that they normally are able to. It's the limit to which we can push ourselves before we start experiencing things going wrong. Now, in stress, there are two main chemicals or hormones that are often implicated. One hormone called adrenaline and the other cortisol. Both work on the principle of providing the body with the energy it needs to deal with threats or stresses. So you could think of them as people who ration resources, sapping resources or taking resources from those who don't need it and giving it to those who need it most. So essentially, adrenaline and cortisol do similar things. If you need to run from a source of threat, your legs get infused with resources and makes it easier for you to run. If you need to worry or think through a problem, your brain gets infused with resources, allowing you to do the work needed. Whilst the level of adrenaline tends to spike quickly and reduce quickly, cortisol levels tend to rise gradually in our system. Now, cortisol is a very, very important hormone. And the current suggestion is that without cortisol, we will simply die. So cortisol is essential to help to activate us. But the problem comes when there's too much cortisol in the system. Right? To understand the implications of cortisol better, I would like to look at 4 areas where cortisol tends to have a physical or emotional impact on us. The first area I'll touch on is to do with panic attacks. And if you struggle with panic attacks, you might recognize this. Many of the clients I've treated who struggle with panic attacks tend to describe their first experience with panic like this. Some were maybe just walking through town, having a cup of tea, or watching TV. So all of a sudden, they just experience the panic come from nowhere, throwing them into this panic spiral. But whenever I look at the details in the experiences of these clients, I tend to find a similar pattern. So generally, they might have been going through a number of stresses in life. Financial stresses, academic stresses, relationship stresses, which will mean that at that time, their cortisol levels was quite high. So if you're spending quite a lot of time worrying, dealing with problems, experiencing one problem after another, it's quite likely your cortisol level will be high. So what I'm trying to say is that with this much cortisol in the system, any sudden threat, any sudden provocation of anxiety will still cause a spike in the adrenaline in the system, which then naturally pushes the individual towards their stress threshold. So if you can turn your attention to this diagram here, this is what I call the coping cup. There's so much cortisol in the system, leaving very little space before hitting the threshold. As a result, tiny amounts of stress would just push us easily to our threshold, causing us to experience those physical symptoms that are so much associated with anxiety. So in other words, the combined effect of cortisol and adrenaline in the system can easily bring on panic attacks. Okay, so moving on. How does cortisol or stress affect our immune system? Recent research studies now suggest that cortisol tends to shorten the lifespan and degrades the productivity of cells. In other words, stress can be destructive to our cells, making us grow older quicker. If you're looking for evidence of this, all you just have to do is look at the effect of stress on American presidents. Stress makes us grow older quicker. But really what's happening is cortisol is causing cells to die quicker and be less productive. And there are a number of research studies that are proving this now. This effect of cortisol impacts all cells of the body, including the immune system. This means that the ability of the immune system to hold back illness becomes sabotaged. And since cortisol affects all cells of the body, cells in our nervous system, our brain cells, become targeted as well. Here, the suggestion is that too much cortisol in the system for a prolonged period of time causes brain cells to shrink. So what's currently believed is that the two particular areas of the brain that are affected by this are the prefrontal cortex, that's the area shaded in red here, and the hippocampus, which is the blue-like feature here. Now, the cortex is the seat of intelligence, where we perform all our calculation, planning, organization. So one way of looking at this is before we do anything, the cortex needs to give a go-ahead for the action. Moving to the hippocampus. The hippocampus is the area that deals with our memory and meaning. For example, the only reason we would recognize a table is because our hippocampus helps us to connect our past memories with what's happening in the moment. What's important to note in this is that, especially in depression, people tend to struggle with being able to organize and plan and to think clearly, as well as being able to remember things. And this has been a factor that's taken into account in the treatment for depression. Talking about depression, what studies are now suggesting is that because of the impact of cortisol on the brain, the neural networks within the brain become inefficient in transporting data. Okay, so just have a brief look at this diagram here. These are neurotransmitters that transmit the information from one neuron to another. Between the neurons, you have a space which is called the synapse. A very simplistic example. You want to jump up. The message must go from your brain to your legs to jump. That data has to be passed from neuron to neuron to neuron to neuron until it gets to the leg, gives the muscles in the leg the instructions to jump. So if this neural network becomes sabotaged, it then becomes understandable why people might struggle to feel activated or motivated. And this is what's implicated in depression. So in depression, there are particular neurotransmitters, norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin, that are implicated. So too little norepinephrine causes an impairment in decision-making processes, creates a lack of motivation, and produces an inability to perform tasks properly. Too little dopamine leads to an inability to experience pleasure. And too little such serotonin will lead to an increase in a sense of grief. Something also important to note is that too little serotonin would cause us to be obsessive in nature. And this is sometimes why people can suddenly become so obsessed with some negative past event. So, whilst we all want things to go well for us, the reality is that life will always throw difficulties at us. An overly high degree of cortisol in our system makes coping with those difficulties even more difficult. So essentially what I'm saying here is that many times we have to go through things that we can't do anything about, situations that are outside our control. So, whilst we're facing life difficulties, allowing stress to take hold on us can be likened to carrying a weight that is twice our size whilst having a boxing match with an enemy. Invariably, this means that the resources we have for coping becomes naturally depleted because our cognition has been sabotaged by stress, our immunity has been sabotaged by stress, ability to function, activate ourselves has been sabotaged by stress. So coping becomes so much difficult. Now, if we can turn this around and find a way to lower the cortisol levels in our system, this increases the space we have for coping, allowing us to cope better with pressures and stresses that life throws at us. And this brings me to the one rule of emotional management. Learn how to reduce your stress levels, and your ability to cope with life's difficulties will improve. So, how do we go about managing stress? Okay, here's a list of strategies that I've found extremely useful. Okay, I'll start from the bottom. The use of biofeedback and electronic aids. Biofeedback mechanisms are very useful for letting us know when we're getting stressed. I often advise people to use them as training tools. With biofeedback, you can gain insight into what kinds of situations stress you out, or the kind of things you might find relaxing or calming. In-depth mental relaxation techniques. These are things like mindfulness, meditation, attention focus training, progressive muscle relaxation, and exercise. I've purposefully written here fast exercise because it's now known that the faster you are able to exercise, the more effective your ability to produce endorphins. Personally, I believe the last two strategies here are extremely important. Learning to apply compassion and changing your thinking and reaction patterns can help to produce a lasting lowering influence on stress levels. So all these strategies have the impact of lowering cortisol levels. Hence, they help our body cells to start to function better, helping our immune system to work better. But more importantly, researchers are now suggesting that those strategies, mindfulness, meditation, exercise, dealing with our thinking patterns, and even medication, help the brain to produce a particular hormone called brain-derived neurotrophic factors, BDNF for short. Right, so these hormones help to keep our brain cells healthy and also help to grow brain cells within certain areas of the brain. So, with more of these hormones in our system, our neural networks work better. Hence, the transportation of signals between our neurons become more effective, which will have a positive effect of reducing depression. In addition, we experience an improvement in our memory, cognition, and comprehension of things. Finally, I urge you to do your own research to verify the things I've shared with you today. I have left some links below this video as a starting point for anyone who would like to explore these subjects further. And if you are watching this video from my YouTube channel, just use the link below the video to go to the correct page on the stresstherapist.net site to find these reference links. But before I go, let me leave you with a final word of encouragement. Please don't give up. Try some of these strategies out. Give yourself some time to recover, and you will notice that your ability to focus, comprehend, and deal with issues will begin to improve the more you reduce the pressure